I didn't say a word. I just smiled and closed the door. That's the part they never saw coming. After everything, the phone calls I didn't return, the letters I didn't open, the birthday cards that went straight from the mailbox into the recycling bin, they still thought I would fall apart when they finally showed up. They still thought I needed them. I haven't needed them since I was 19 years old. Let me take you back to the beginning, because the beginning matters. It always does. I grew up in a house in Naperville, Illinois that looked from the outside like a dream. 4 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone else's name. My father was a regional manager for a logistics company. My mother did part-time bookkeeping and spent the rest of her time maintaining appearances, the right church, the right women's club, the right story about who we were as a family. The story didn't include a daughter who got into trouble. I was 19 when I found out I was pregnant. I was 2 semesters into community college, working 20 hours a week at a pharmacy, and I had been dating someone for almost a year, a guy named Holden who I genuinely thought I was in love with. We were stupid and careless, and then we were in a situation neither of us was ready for. Holden disappeared so fast I barely had time to register that he was gone. One conversation about the pregnancy and he stopped answering my calls. I left 3 messages. Then I stopped leaving messages. I told my mother on a Tuesday evening in October. She put down her cup of tea very slowly and looked at me like I was something she had tracked in on the bottom of her shoe. She didn't yell. That wasn't her way. She just said, "I'll tell your father when he gets home," and walked out of the kitchen. My father got home at 6:15. By 6:30, they had decided together. I could hear them through the wall, the low, controlled voices that were somehow more frightening than shouting, that they could not have this in their house, that I had embarrassed them, that if I made this choice, I had to live with it somewhere else. By Friday, I was on the couch of a girl from work named Felicity, with 2 duffel bags and about $400 to my name. I want to be honest about what that period of my life actually felt like, because people tend to romanticize survival. They talk about it like it's a montage. It wasn't. It was humiliating and exhausting, and there were nights I ate crackers and peanut butter for dinner and cried so hard my chest hurt. Felicity was kind, but she had her own life, her own problems. I couldn't stay forever. After 3 weeks, I found a room in a shared house near the college. 5 people, 1 bathroom, walls so thin you could hear everything. It cost me $3.50 a month. I dropped to part-time at school and picked up extra hours at the pharmacy. I miscarried at 11 weeks. I was at work when it started. I finished my shift, drove myself to urgent care, and sat in a beige waiting room for 2 hours before they saw me. There was no one to call. I didn't call my parents. I didn't call Holden. I sat in that waiting room holding a paper cup of water, and I thought, I am completely alone in this, and I have to figure out how to survive it. That thought, not the grief. Though that was real and it took a long time to move through. But that specific, clear, functional thought is the one that changed me. I did not contact my parents to tell them about the miscarriage. I had nothing to say to them. They had made a choice, and so had I. The next 3 years are hard to condense because they were not dramatic. They were just relentless. I moved twice, worked constantly, finished my associate's degree, and then transferred to a state school in Indiana on a partial scholarship. I studied accounting because I was good with numbers and because I understood, in a very bone-deep way, that financial security was the only kind of independence that actually held. I waited tables on weekends. I had a meal plan that I stretched carefully. I graduated with my bachelor's degree at 24 with about $12,000 in student loans and a job offer from a mid-size accounting firm in Indianapolis. I was not a millionaire by 30. I want to say that clearly because those stories, the ones where a woman survives something terrible and 10 years later she's running a company worth 8 figures, they're exciting, but they're not always true. And I think the truer version of this story is more useful. What I was by 30 was stable, genuinely sustainably stable. I had paid off my loans. I had a 401k that I contributed to every month. I had an emergency fund. I had a one-bedroom apartment in a nice neighborhood in Indianapolis that I had furnished slowly over years with things I actually liked. I had built a life that was quiet and solid and entirely mine. I had also built a wall around myself that I didn't fully understand until I tried to date seriously and kept pulling back every time someone got close. That's a different story. The short version is I eventually did the work, found a good therapist named Dr. Weston, and spent about 2 years learning how to trust people again. At 31, I met someone. His name was Conrad. He was a civil engineer, calm and patient and almost aggressively genuine. We dated for 2 years, and then he asked me to marry him in the kitchen of his apartment in February. No fanfare, just him on one knee with a ring his grandmother had left him. I said yes before he finished the question. I told my therapist before I told anyone else, because I had spent years not having anyone to tell things to, and old habits are stubborn. She cried, which made me cry, which was embarrassing and also exactly right. I had been completely no contact with my parents for 9 years at that point. They had tried in the early years. A few phone calls, a letter that found its way to my college address, a card at Christmas. I didn't respond to any of it, not out of cruelty, but because every time I thought about opening that door, I thought about that kitchen in October and my mother's face and my father's controlled voice through the wall, and I knew I wasn't ready to be in the same room as any of that. Conrad knew about my family. He had grown up in a home with its own complications, not the same kind, but he understood the concept of chosen distance. He never pressured me about it. He did ask once, early on, whether I thought I would ever want to address it. I told him I didn't know. He said okay and never brought it up again unless I did. We got married in September, a small ceremony in a garden venue outside the city. 30 people. His family, my friends, my coworkers, my therapist. Nobody from my family. I wore a dress I had bought with my own money and walked myself down the aisle. And it was one of the best decisions I have ever made in my life. It felt like a declaration. The year after the wedding, I got promoted to senior manager at the firm. Conrad's company won a significant contract and he took on a supervisory role. We talked about buying a house. We talked carefully and honestly about whether we wanted children. We decided we did, and that conversation, just two adults sitting across from each other and deciding something together, felt like the opposite of everything I had known growing up. I was 33 when my parents showed up. I want to be precise about the sequence of events because the details matter. It was a Saturday afternoon in April. Conrad was at the hardware store. I was in the backyard. We had bought a house the previous fall, a 3-bedroom Craftsman in Broad Ripple, pulling weeds from around the rose bushes, which is something I do when I'm thinking through a problem at work. I had dirt on my knees and my hair was in a bun and my phone was inside. The doorbell rang. I didn't hear it the first time. The second time, I pulled off my gardening gloves, went in through the back door, and walked to the front of the house. I looked through the window beside the door before I opened it, the way you do when you're not expecting anyone, and I felt something go very still inside me because standing on my front porch were my parents. My mother in a camel coat, my father in a jacket I didn't recognize. 14 years older than the last time I had seen them, a little smaller somehow. I stood there for a moment, just breathing. Then I opened the door. "We need to talk to you," my father said. He had the same voice. Of course he did. My mother said, "Sweetheart," like that word cost her nothing. I looked at them both. I said, "How did you find my address?" My father said they had hired someone, a search service. He said it very matter-of-factly, like that was a completely normal thing to do, like I had just stepped out for a moment and they had simply tracked me down. He said they were sorry. He said they had made a terrible mistake. He said a lot of things in a very short amount of time, the way people do when they have rehearsed something and are afraid of being interrupted. And then he said the part that clarified everything. He said that my grandmother, his mother, a woman I had loved very much and not seen since I was 19, had passed away 8 months earlier, and that in her will she had left a specific provision, a substantial trust that was designated for her grandchildren, and that the trust had conditions. that in order to release the funds, documentation was required, including, among other things, verification of the family line and any living descendants. My mother stepped forward slightly at this point. She said, "We just want to know about the baby, sweetheart. We want to make things right." I looked at her. I said, "What baby?" My father blinked. He said, "Your child. When you left, you were pregnant." I said, "I left 14 years ago. I was 19. What exactly do you think you're going to find?" My mother said they understood a great deal of time had passed. She said they weren't trying to intrude. She said they just wanted to meet the child, reconnect, be part of our lives. She said it the way you describe a simple errand, like they were asking if they could stop by for coffee. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment because it surprised me. I expected anger. I expected the old grief to flare up. But what I actually felt was something much quieter than that. Something almost like clarity. These two people had stood in a kitchen in Naperville 14 years ago and told me to leave. They had watched me walk out the door with 2 duffel bags and a broken-down heart. They had not called to check whether I was alive when I was 19 and pregnant and couch surfing. They had not called when I miscarried. They had not called when I graduated or got a job or moved across state lines or built a life from materials that had nothing to do with them. And now they were standing on my porch, looking for documentation for a trust, looking for a grandchild who would satisfy a legal provision. Not for me. Not once in any of this had any of it been for me. I said, "There is no child." My mother said, "What do you mean?" I said, "I miscarried at 11 weeks. 14 years ago. There is no child." A long silence. My father said, "We didn't know." I said, "No, you didn't, because you weren't there." My mother started to say something. I think she was going to say she was sorry. I genuinely do not know whether she meant it. And I found, standing there in my dirty garden clothes with the April light coming down on the 3 of us, that I didn't need to find out. It wasn't information I required. It wasn't a door I needed to open. I said, "I hope you find what you're looking for with the estate, but I can't help you with that." And then I closed the door. I stood in my front hallway for a moment. I listened to the sound of them on the porch, a murmured exchange, footsteps, then quiet. I looked at the framed print on the wall that Conrad and I had bought at a street market the summer before, a print of a botanical illustration with yellow margins, and I thought about nothing in particular for a little while. Then I went back out to the garden and finished pulling weeds. Conrad came home about 40 minutes later. I heard the garage door and then his voice calling from inside asking where I was. I called back and he came around the side of the house with a paper bag from the hardware store and his easy, unhurried walk, and he looked at my face and said, "What happened?" I told him. All of it, sitting on the back steps while the light changed. He listened the way he always does, without interrupting, without problem solving before I was finished, just listening. When I was done, he sat with it for a moment, and then he said, "How do you feel?" I thought about that honestly. I said, like I don't have to wonder anymore, because that's the thing no one tells you about estrangement, the part that's quietly corrosive, the part that lives in the back of your head on ordinary days. Not the grief exactly, though that's real. It's the wondering whether you did the right thing, whether they ever changed, whether there was something you missed or misread, whether the door should have been open a little. When you have no information, you fill the space with questions. They had answered them all, standing on my porch with a legal provision and 14 years of silence. I filed to have my grandmother's estate contacted by our attorney, simply to confirm that I had no claim and no information to provide. That was the last contact I had with anything related to my family of origin. The trust was their problem to sort out. The legal architecture of who owed what to whom in the estate of a woman I had loved and grieved privately was not something I was going to be pulled into for their benefit. My therapist asked me at our next session how I felt about the visit. I told her the same thing I had told Conrad. She asked whether there was any grief in it, any part of me that had wanted something else from that conversation. I sat with that for a long time before I answered. I said. Maybe. Maybe there's a version of that encounter where my mother says something real and means it, where my father drops the rehearsed speech and looks at me like I'm his daughter instead of a loose end. Maybe there's a version where something shifts. I can't rule out that I would have wanted that once, but that's not what happened. And at some point, you have to decide whether you're going to keep the door open for a version of people that doesn't exist. I decided a long time ago that the door was closed. Standing in my hallway that April afternoon, I felt it click shut in a way it hadn't quite, fully, until that moment. That winter, we found out I was pregnant. I was careful this time about how I told people. I wanted it to feel different from every other time the word pregnant had lived in my life. Conrad and I drove to his parents' house in Columbus and told them over dinner. His mother cried. His father shook Conrad's hand and then hugged me very hard and said, "Welcome to the hard part." We bought a rocking chair for the nursery. We painted the room a warm, soft yellow. Conrad assembled the crib wrong the first time and had to take the whole thing apart and start over. And I sat on the floor eating crackers and reading him the instructions aloud, and we laughed a lot. My son was born in August. He is the loudest and most opinionated person I have ever met, and he has Conrad's eyebrows and no patience for anything. Watching Conrad hold him in the hospital, this massive, careful man going completely still with this small, furious, perfect person on his chest, is something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. There are things I feel sad about sometimes. I'm honest about that. There's a version of my life in which my parents are at the hospital, in which my mother holds my son, in which things that broke when I was 19 were repaired over time, and we all became different people together. I let myself feel sad about that version. And then I come back to this one, where my son has 4 grandparents who are present and steady and genuinely glad to know him, where he has a father who reassembles cribs and reads instructions and laughs on the floor, where he has a mother who knows, from long practice, how to build things from scratch. The people who threw me out in the cold came back looking for something I couldn't give them, a child who doesn't exist, a document, a thread to pull. I gave them the only honest answer I had. There is no child. There is only me, and the life I built, and the people who actually showed up. I've thought a lot about what it actually takes to walk away from a door you've just closed, not storm away, not collapse against the wall, just turn around and go back to pulling weeds in your own garden. That took me a long time to be able to do. Not the walking away part, the being okay with it part. What my parents did when I was 19 wasn't just cruel. It was a kind of moral failure that compounded itself over 14 years of silence. They chose reputation over a daughter. They chose distance over accountability. And then, when the math of an inheritance made a grandchild suddenly useful, they drove to my house and rang my doorbell like none of it had happened. That's not a mistake, that's a pattern. And patterns tell you everything you need to know about who a person actually is, once you're willing to look at them plainly. I was willing to look at them plainly by the time they showed up. That didn't happen by accident. It happened because I spent years genuinely uncomfortable, sometimes painful years, learning how to think clearly about my own life. What was my responsibility? What wasn't? Where I had made good decisions and where I had made fearful ones. Therapy helped. Conrad helped. But mostly it was the slow, unglamorous work of sitting with difficult questions until I had honest answers. That kind of clear thinking is something you have to earn. It doesn't arrive on its own. The resilience piece. I almost don't have words for how different that concept looks from the inside. People say resilient, like it's a personality trait you're born with. Like some people just bounce and others don't. What I know is that I was not naturally resilient. I was scared for years. I ate crackers for dinner and cried in urgent care, waiting rooms, and moved twice before I was 22. The resilience was not a characteristic. It was a decision I made over and over in small increments on days when I genuinely did not want to make it. Getting up and going to work when I was grieving. Applying to transfer when I wasn't sure I was smart enough. Saying yes to Conrad when part of me wanted to pull back. None of that felt brave in the moment. It just felt like the only option available, and I took it. And the integrity part. That's the one I'm most proud of, honestly. Not the career, not the house, not the 401k. The fact that when my parents stood on my porch and offered me a reason to let them back in, I told them the truth instead of what was convenient. There was nothing to gain from lying. There was nothing to gain from performing a reunion I didn't feel. The honest answer was the only one I had, and I gave it, and then I went back to my life. That's what I want to leave with anyone who is sitting with something similar right now. Some version of a door that keeps presenting itself, some relationship that asks you to be smaller or dishonest or endlessly forgiving of things that were never actually addressed. You don't owe anyone a reunion that cost you your own clarity. You are allowed to tell the truth. You are allowed to close the door. And you are allowed to close the door. And you are allowed to go back to your garden and finish what you were doing. The life I built is not a consolation prize. It's the whole point.